Hey there, Golf Cast Nation. This is Brian Bailie here, bringing you our first episode of Whiskey High IQ. I'm going to put a little guest here is Four Roses single barrel. And as we know, Four Roses is by far one of the most popular American bourbons. So thank you, Mr. Four Roses, for that. And again, we are running the single barrel. We'll talk about what single barrel means in the future. But to get started, cheers. I'm a big fan of Four Roses single barrel. Very sweet, lots of vanilla, lots of caramel, spice, really good whiskey. I would definitely say for casual whiskey drinkers, it's a good one for you. And also inside a golf cask, anytime you see I always double tap. That is an Irish tradition. The Irish tradition says if you double tap your whiskey, it will release evil spirits to make your whiskey taste better. So that's why that is done inside the podcast. Just some behind the scenes stuff. So what we're going to talk about today is this is kind of our intro. I sent out questions to Golf Cask members and said, what do you want to learn more about? And the one thing I'm getting the most response back, especially from younger whiskey drinkers, is I want to learn more about whiskey. What is whiskey? How is it made? What are the grains and things like that? So here we go. We're going to talk about what is whiskey and the major grains inside of this episode. Big concepts. I want you to understand kind of the ethos, the DNA of your whiskey. And then from that, we'll build upon that and be able to start to understand how we taste, pull out certain notes from these different grains so you can start to expand your knowledge base inside of the whiskey world. So without further ado, what is a whiskey? Who knows, right? Whiskey is a distilled spirit made from a grain mash. So what they do is they take a grain, they grind it up, they add it to water, and they let it sit for a few days. Then they will add yeast. Yeast eats on the sugars produced by the grain and thus creates alcohol. Then it runs through a distilling process that we'll talk about. And from that, they are able to elevate the amount of alcohol that comes from the still. Usually takes 2 to 3 runs to be able to create the proof that you want. And there you go. It is that easy. So technically, whiskey is vegan. All right, it's just grain, yeast, and water. It is a very simple process, and a process that was done in the olden days because it was much easier to deliver a barrel of whiskey than it was to bring bushels and bushels of corn or grains or wheat to market. So it was also something that a farmer could do rather easily, as well as a whiskey can sit on the shelf for years and years and years, where corn or wheat or barley in a bag, shelf life is very small, right? So that's kind of the differences in kind of the economics and understanding why distilling was so important and why it was done by so many people. Also, a little fun fact inside of whiskey, you'll see whiskey with an E and you'll see whiskey with a Y. What is that about? That's just regions being regions, right? So Scotch, the Japanese, and the Canadians, those three, there's 5 main regions of whiskey. Now, whiskey is being produced all over the world, but there's 5 main regions. The 3 I just talked about, Canada, Scotland, and Japan, they do it with a Y. And that is just, again, is a spin-off of the water of life. And so with that, they actually take away the E, where the Irish and the American versions of whiskey add an E. So whether you put an E on it or not, doesn't really matter. It's still whiskey. It is still the water of life, aqua via. So again, it's just kind of a way to think about it differently than from region to region. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the main 4 grains, and I have some examples of different whiskeys that will have these grains. The main 4 grains would be corn, barley, rye, and wheat. Now there's other grains and combinations of these grains inside of the mash to create a different flavor profile, but these will be the main 4. So the grandfather of them all would be barley. Barley is a native grass that is grown, a grain that is grown inside of Ireland, Scotland, again, the home of whiskey. From what all the data says, it really looks like Ireland was the first country that produced whiskey, but Scotland was the first country to produce it and market it and send it all around the world. Scotch is the #1 spirit in the world, #1 whiskey in the world. So again, it's a really cool way that and that's done by the Scots. But again, the Irish claim to be the inventors, and the first writings were actually inside of the Irish heritage. So again, it's like golf and whiskey. Who's first? Irish, Scots. They're roughly the same, but once again, they kind of argue on it. But they use the grain called barley. So barley is a rich, complex grain. A lot of times with it, you'll get notes of course, malt, a lot of sugary sweet. You'll get kind of a nutty tone, and also pull some fruits out of it. So the beauty of a pot stilled, which is an Irish production, and a Scotch is they typically use barley. Now what you'll a lot of times hear is called malted barley. Malted means where they actually take the barley, because barley is a really tough grain. So what they like to do is they will add water to it and have it sprout. And right when it sprouts, they hit it with heat just to be able to kill the growing process. And from that basically breaks the shell. Now the enzymes, and when they put it in the mash, are ready to go. So it's a really smart way of tricking the grain to break without you having to physically break it. So a lot of times you'll hear malted barley or malted. That is just, again, the process that the barley went under, right? So why do distillers like barley, right? Why is that a really important feature inside of a lot of whiskeys? And if you look at almost all whiskeys have some sort of barley in it. Number one is that enzyme. It is a fermentation lover. It creates lots of sugars and lots of enzymes that help create whiskey. So you don't have to add sugar and things like that. The beauty is the barley pulls a lot of that sled with you. So just the fact that inside the mash, barley is a really, really powerful tool to be able to create that alcohol, that low wines, that first run of the actual fermentation, where the yeast is eating on the sugars and actually creating an alcohol product. And again, whiskey and beer are very similar up to this stage, right? They use this kind of the same processes. So low wines is, again, that initial run of fermented grain. The other piece that distillers like is that barley gives you a really smooth and a very deep, complex grain. It is very functional. It is very it just casts a wide net on what barley actually tastes like, or malted barley. So it just gives you that depth and that flavor profile. And again, if you think of Scotches, you think of Irishes, and of course American single malts, you're getting this deep, complex flavor, and that is mainly being driven by its grain, malted barley or barley. Challenges of the enzyme, right? One is it's very expensive. It's the most expensive of the grain. And you have to be really careful in the malting procedure, right? If you malt it, so when you're sprouting it, if you sprout it too fast, or it grows too much, you ruin the grain. Or if you hit it with too much heat, you burn the grain. So you got to be really, the distiller has to be very cognizant inside of the malting period to be able to create those flavors. And inside of this malting period is where a lot of Scotches get that smoky flavor, because they stop the malting, the growth procedure, with peat. So they burn peat, which is kind of the decomposed foliage that is all throughout Scotland and Ireland. So they'll actually burn the peat, and it'll get that smoky, earthy flavor. So if you're a peated whiskey fan, once again, you're going to be a huge malt fan. So that would be malt. So again, I have Glenkitchy 12, which is one of my favorite Scotches. We have Powers, John Lane, and then of course I have here Temple Bar 15, as well as Tomatin Legacy. So again, good Scotches and good Irishes. As a newer drinker, if you're starting this quest, I love airplane bottles, or the little bottles, because one, you don't have to make a huge investment. It'll cost you a couple dollars, and it gives you a really good tasting. And then again, if you like that whiskey, now you can go and buy the bottle. The worst thing you can do is buy a bottle, taste it, and hate it, right? And I just paid $70 for this Japanese whiskey, and I have one on my shelf, and I hate it. I do not like it at all, and I've even tried to give it away, and nobody will take it. That tells you, again, the flavor profile of my friends as well. But the idea of actually taking an airplane bottle, these smaller sample bottles, is a good way to kind of start your journey inside of whiskey. So we've talked about barley. Next big one we're going to talk about is corn. So when you think of corn, I think of bourbon, right? So we have Green River, which is a lower end whiskey. We have Wild Turkey, Evan Williams, Elijah Craig, Wild Turkey. Even Lost here is a bourbon, and Evan Williams. So what is a bourbon? Bourbon is 51% corn. Right? So when you start thinking of corn as a grain, most people immediately will run to bourbons, and we'll talk about what makes a bourbon in upcoming episodes. But understand that corn is the #1 driver for a bourbon, and it is the majority grain coming out of the U.S. Why? Because we create a whole lot of corn, right? So when you think of corn, you think of high sugar. So bourbons tend to be really, really sweet. They can be really, really smooth. They can be rich and full-bodied. And you're also going to start pulling vanilla and caramel notes from the corn mash, which is awesome. Why do distillers like using corn? One, it's cheap. It's the cheapest grain in the States, very cheap, and it's very approachable when you actually put it in your whiskey. It's very soft, it's very sweet. It has those great flavor profiles that a lot of people like. So that's why most distillers like using corn. And then the challenge is you got to be careful because it can get infections inside of the fermentation process that will ruin your mash and not allow you to run it through the stills. So it's a very sensitive on that aspect. Basic different bacteria will grow that you don't want to grow. And the other really cool pieces that the distiller has to think about is it's a very heavy mash, a very sticky mash, right? So heavy and sticky can cause all kind of issues in the distilling process. But again, corn by far is probably the most popular grain coming out of Canada and out of the US just because it's one of our native grains. Now granted, we have hybrided the heck out of it, but it is by far one of the most common grains inside the US. And again, I think of bourbon, right? And then the next one down the line would be rye. So to me, the third grain would be rye. Rye gives you very bold, very intense flavors. I started my journey with Irish whiskeys, which are malted. They're usually triple distilled, very happy, very friendly. But I've actually turned more into a rye guy. I love that bold, peppery punch to rye. So I have really started to, I would say my flavor profile has gone all the way over into the rye category. That is probably one of my favorites. And what's really cool about rye is, yes, you get kind of a pepper, you can get cinnamon, but you can also pull citrus flavors from it. So it's really interesting. So a lot of times in a blind tasting, when I start getting citrus notes and things like that, it makes me think of rye, right? So, because you're not always going to get the peppery, the cinnamon flavors. Some ryes will come out a little bit different. That citrus note could be the piece that separates you and allows you to understand the grain. Why do distillers like it? Well, due to its bold complexity, its big spice, a lot of punchy flavors, rye is used a lot in whiskey. So there are ryes where they're just 100% rye. Here I have Mitchers, I have Whistle Pig 10, I have Piggyback 6. So there are a lot of ryes out there that are just 100% rye, but you will also see on the marketplace what they call high rye bourbons. So what that means is corn has to be 51% at a minimum to be a bourbon, but what the second main grain inside of the mash would be a rye. So, you know, that could range anywhere from 10% to up to 30% of rye, and that's going to give you that sweet caramely bourbon, but that spicy bite in the back end. And by far, high ryes are probably my favorite bourbon. So here inside of the state of Virginia, I love Lost, Wild Turkey, Rare Breed, Evan Breed, Wild Turkey. They are high rye grains. High rye bourbons, I love that. So I love that punchy, spicy component. And of course, rye is native to the U.S. Back when George Washington was, before he was president, and after he was president, he was one of the largest distillers in the United States. He brought a Scotsman over and tried to make malt whiskeys, but inside of the States, we could not grow barley. Our native grain was rye. So basically, George Washington, our founding father, was the founding father and the largest producer of rye whiskey in the U.S. Good factoid for you. Challenges of rye is it can be sticky and difficult to work with inside of the mash, and again, those big bold flavors can overtake all the different flavors inside of the whiskey. So managing the amount of rye inside of your mash is really important to give you the flavor profile you're looking for. And then the final one would be wheat. You know, we have Weller's here, I have Larceny, I have Nulu over there, Maker's Mart. These would be wheated whiskeys. There are wheaters that are just 100% wheat, but they're very rare and very hard to find. Most of the wheat whiskeys that you run across inside of your local liquor store would be probably wheated bourbons. So it's going to be a bourbon, so it's going to be 51% corn, and it's going to have a large mash bill of wheat. What does wheat give you? Well, think about, what do you use wheat in your daily life? You think of bread, right? So it's going to give you a very mellow, easy drinking whiskey. It's going to give you sweet flavors. It's going to give you honey flavors. It's going to give you that baked bread flavors, right? Think of wheat bread, you know. So it's going to give you a lot of those tones. For me, I think wheated whiskeys are a great whiskey to start with as a beginner. So if you're a newbie and you're thinking maybe some of these flavors are a little bold, a little rash, or a little harsh to you, I think a wheated whiskey just kind of smooths the edges, makes it a little more balanced, a little more delicate, and you'll really enjoy it. And that's one of the main reasons distillers like to use wheat in their actual process, because it does bring balance and it does bring smoothness. Pappy Van Winkle, one of the unicorns inside of the whiskey world, is a wheated bourbon. So again, you do have that luxury of being able to find a smoother, easier drinking whiskey, which would be wheated. And then the final challenge inside of the wheated mash bill would be, it's really delicate and it's very easy to be overpowered. You'll see a lot of 4-grain whiskeys where they'll use corn, barley, rye, and wheat. A lot of times, if it's not done properly, the wheat will just never be tasted, because the other flavors are so powerful, it just kind of overwhelms the wheat. But again, it does provide a really, really smooth finish. I'm not the hugest wheated fan. I do have Old Elk. Like I said, I have a bunch of wheats on the shelf. Lost makes a great wheat as well. But again, not my biggest flavor profile that I like, but I do enjoy a good wheated whiskey, especially because it's smooth. Especially in the summertime, I really enjoy it. But again, this gives you a good sense of what the different whiskeys are around the world, the different regions and the different grains, and how that profile will kind of shape what your whiskey tastes like. Now remember, to be a whiskey, we talked about it's a fermented grain. But the other really cool part about a whiskey is it has to be aged or stored inside of some sort of barrel, usually an oak barrel. And the whiskey core DNA comes from the flavor of the grain, but the whiskey barrel will produce a lot of flavors as well. So depending on what type of barrel, how long it's been in the barrel, is the barrel new or old, is it charred, what the different components are, will bring different flavor profiles into that whiskey. But at its core, all whiskeys are the same. It's a grain that has been distilled and has gone through a fermentation process, which means turning the sugars in the grain into alcohol. So without further ado, that is what we do inside of whiskey to understand our grains. Again, 4 roses. That's a very nice whiskey. So in summary, next time you pull up a glass, you cheers to your friends. Think about the grain. Think about what grain, what is the mash bill, what is the #1 grain inside of that, and can I start to understand what these flavor notes are? Again, the core, the DNA of your whiskey is that grain, right? That is where the base profile is coming from. Yes, there's other factors that are going to provide flavor, but that core, that grain, is going to give the essence of what that whiskey is. So the beauty is once you start to understand what the different grains are and you start to understand what the basic flavor profiles are, you can start predicting whiskeys, start to understand and categorize as you're tasting what the whiskey is, and it just gives you more insight and more ability and more fun inside of your tastings, that you can start to understand why the distiller picked the grain and created what they created. So I encourage you to go out and buy a bunch of sample bottles, try a bunch of different whiskeys, go with the barley, go with the corn, go with rye, go with wheat. Really challenge yourself, figure out what profiles you enjoy the most. The ones that you don't enjoy as much, make sure you circle back in a couple weeks, months, because as you get more into whiskey, those profiles can change, and we don't want you to push out an entire classification of whiskeys just because of one bad tasting note. So without further ado, I wish you farewell, enjoy, cheers, and I look forward to bringing you our next episode next week, where we're going to actually talk about each individual whiskey and what the notes are, and actually start setting up tastings so you can really understand what you're tasting and give you a good sense on how to become a better connoisseur, a better enthusiast, and a person that people will look to inside of tastings and say, what notes did you get? So we're gonna talk about that next week. So long, farewell, Salancha, cheers, and till I see you again.